Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. If you've watched any of my prior videos, you'll be well aware of my critiques of the third act of Baldur's Gate 3. In many ways, stepping into Act 3 opens up a world much wider, grander and richer than ever before, but in another way, it's also emptier and less polished. I've discussed some of my issues with this act in my big Baldur's Gate 3 critique from a while back, but today I thought it'd be a good idea to break down all the problems with Act 3 and discuss them with you all. I think I should preface all this by saying that I do really love Act 3, but I also believe it's important to look back at how its sheer ambition leads to something that often feels unfinished. Also quickly, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subbing to the channel and dropping a like, and without further ado, let's get right into it. To start this all off, I'd like to begin with discussing the pacing and structure of Act 3. When you first step into Act 3, it's obvious that something feels different, and I don't just mean in terms of the scenery or the threat on the horizon, but I mean this in the way the rhythm of the narrative itself, which once pulsed so cleanly through Acts 1 and 2, begins to waver. From your early hours in Baldur's Gate 3, the game guides you with a sort of steady cadence, giving you crises to solve and the gathering of your closest allies and companions. At this point in your journey, you would have marched through the goblin camp with confidence, explored the Underdark with caution, and found your way out of the dreadful Shadow-cursed lands. Each act to this point feels like it has been building to this, and when you finally walk through the gates of Baldur's Gate, it truly does feel magical. But all of this bliss and wonder disappears along with the sense of urgency that was always present in earlier acts. I don't think there's doubt in anyone's mind that Act 3 is by far the game's largest section. It easily has the most amount of content compared to any other part of the game, but in many ways this sheer volume of content is one of the Act's downfalls. Act 3 will give you a gigantic map, a ton of side quests, and possibilities blooming in every corner. But because of this, that sense of driving the narrative forward begins to lose its grip, and I think all of this starts with the city itself. Everywhere you go in this city, from its rooftops to its alleys, there are crowds and NPCs all over the place. There is just so much to do, and it really is a blur of detail, but it's also what makes the pacing of the game as a whole suffer. There's never any sense of direction or tension in Act 3, and even when there's hints of it early on, it quickly disappears. Let's just take the example of the circus area in Rivington. As you explore this area and interact with its various oddities, Orin will crash the event in one sequence, disguising herself as an owner of one of the many attractions around the circus. This gave me my first jolt of the potential of Act 3, where almost everywhere you went, you'd be reminded of the evil that lingers, and that Orin and Gortash will not stop until they get you. But unfortunately, after this moment, you're simply invited to wander the rest of the lower city in Rivington and explore all of it without any worry in the world. Now, I won't sit here and act like exploring all of these new areas doesn't lead to some of the most beautiful moments in the entire game. But when you're supposed to be in the game's final chapter, generally strolling through the city feels kind of off. You really can't go 2 steps in the city without new quests or NPCs popping up. And while this is great from a content standpoint, it's strange when the Absolute's army is supposed to literally be at your doorstep. It's like the game keeps reminding you of the looming threat, but at the same time tells you to check out these 20 other random things before tackling the main quest. It's this combination of an overwhelming amount of content and the drop of urgency in the narrative that creates pacing and structure that feels off. Where before you were given a steady stream to swim in, the game now floods you with content, and it makes the overall adventure begin to lack direction. Now, this isn't due to the game's loss of ambition, but it's actually quite the opposite. Larian really tried to fit as much as they could into the game's final act, but the sheer ambition of it all unanchored what was once a tightly paced experience. Talking more about the structure, it's definitely another problem in Act 3 and goes hand in hand with the pacing issues. In Acts 1 and 2, your steps always felt like they were going forward, even if they were incremental. You knew what the next major beat would be, from the Emerald Grove to the Underdark to Moonrise Towers. All of it meant something and it all flowed so well together. In Act 3, you definitely get remnants of that well-made structure, but this is diluted by bundles of detours all around you. The main threat is supposed to be at its very climax in this act, but this only really feels obvious if you're tackling just the main quests themselves. It never really feels like the quests or NPCs you encounter in Act 3 are actually pulling you forward towards the game's conclusion, as every detour sends you further off the main path instead of driving the story forward. This doesn't of course mean that Act 3 doesn't have its strong standalone moments, because of course it does, but as a chapter structurally it suffers from its sheer scale without accelerating the stakes that are supposed to be at their boiling point. Everything begins to become messy, and not because the narrative or quests themselves are bad, but because the pacing between all of these components simply isn't as clean or polished as earlier acts. To be entirely clear, I don't think Act 3's pacing and structural issues are a fatal flaw, and the pure ambition of Act 3 is truly remarkable in every way, but especially on your first run through this game, where you expect the final act to amplify every component from the choices, to the characters, to the world itself, the structural misfires definitely feel much more noticeable. For me, in many ways, the magic of the first 2 acts came in the tightness of the story and the surrounding content, and how everything you did in these acts would push the journey forward in some way. When I entered Act 3, I definitely did feel the boundaries of the game expand, but with them, the feeling of actually being pulled forward almost completely diminished. Once I finished Act 3 for the very first time, like many of you, I came to the realization that pacing and structure is absolutely crucial in a game as massive as Baldur's Gate 3, especially in its final stretch. Act 3 is where you feel like the game is on rails, heading towards its climax, ready to elevate the impact of every choice you've made thus far. But instead, the rails begin to blur and the tension begins to dilute itself, with the act becoming a messy combination of ambition and pure scale. All in all, if you came into Act 3 like me expecting a trumpet blast, you may instead find a sprawling orchestra tuning, and as we all know, even the most beautiful instruments sound off-key without a great conductor. For me personally, reactivity is the biggest problem I have with Act 3 of the game. Now, when I talk about the reactivity of choices in Baldur's Gate 3, I'm not just referring to what you choose, but I'm talking about how the world and your companions in turn respond. In Acts 1 and 2 of the game, every decision, and I really mean every decision you made, truly echoed. A companion may look uneasy, the chatter of the camp may shift, and entire lines of dialogue would branch out and completely alter. That sort of ripple effect that would happen with every single choice you made, from minor decisions to decisions that would shape you and your companions, it all kind of disappears in Act 3, and for me, the feeling that I mattered in this world also vanished in turn. Now, there are still important choices to make in Act 3, as of course there would be. In fact, choices like whether to free Orpheus or to give up Shadowheart to Viconia mark some of the most impactful decisions you can make in the entire game. But actually feeling these choices is a whole nother story. Now, Act 3 inherently gives you the freedom to betray your companions, to side with Raphael, and to let Volo burn, but the actual reactions to such choices are much more silent than ever before. It's something that I believe you would have also felt in your first run through Act 3, as where before your choices would cause all of your companions and the world itself to react. This sense of reactivity drops significantly. Throughout your journey in Act 1 and a fair amount of Act 2, the reactions of your companions to the most important choices you made would be much more frequent. But in Act 3, this drops off a cliff, where even if you finish an extremely important quest within the narrative, your companions will often have nothing to say, or at best a simple one-liner. Now, this silence really does matter. To me, it transforms a world that once felt so alive into one that almost feels watched. I personally remember finishing Shadowheart's companion quest for the first time, where one of the game's most emotionally charged moments involving her parents happens. Now, when I first finished this quest, I expected a ton of dialogue and reactions from other companions, but instead what I got was a bunch of one-liners and a camp that was mostly quiet. Of course, the choice that I made in that quest still existed, but the actual response to it was much more muted than I would have expected from such a critical moment in the game. To me, this lack of response and reactivity from my fellow companions led to the moment losing some of its weight. Examples like this illustrate the decline of companion approvals and interactions in Act 3 when compared to prior acts in the game. Where earlier I could feel a companion's loyalty or doubt echo in the camp, in Act 3 these echoes fade into nothingness. Now, of course, there are still plenty of unique interactions from companions in response to certain decisions made, but in an act as dense and supposedly climactic as Act 3, it rarely ever feels like enough. The world asks you to believe that the stakes are higher, but it never feels like your companions are of the same mindset. To me, when choices begin to feel less impactful, the agency provided by Larian also begins to blur into illusion. Another major choice I feel should have had so much more standing in terms of reactivity was the decision as to whether Astarion should ascend or not. This is a decision that really should have been earth-shattering, but once the decision is made and you long rest, the reaction of your fellow companions and of the world around you are simply muted. A few words are uttered and companions will make their quick remarks, but the world itself barely flickers. The choice of course still exists, but its echo was as faint as ever. Again, a lot of the problems with Act 3 are due to its pure scale, and it's this very scale that makes the missing echoes of your choices become so distracting. If I walk into my camp after completing hours of quests within the city and hear the same dialogue I heard 5 hours ago, something begins to break. You begin to feel like a passenger instead of the driver of your own story. Now, I'm not saying that Act 3 completely loses the essence of choices and impact that the game emanates with in earlier acts, but what I am saying is that the texture of reactions to the choices you make in this act are much blurrier than ever before. Now, when you look at Act 3 on paper, it has the most major choices of any act in the game, and well, that makes sense considering it's the act responsible for wrapping up all of the game's major story and companion threads. But in practice, these choices lose much of the essence of the reactivity Baldur's Gate 3 has in earlier parts of the game, as the world and your companions stop responding to you, even when you make more decisions than ever before. Of course, some of you may still ask, why does this even matter in the grander scope of things? And to me, because part of what makes Baldur's Gate 3 feel so generational in Acts 1 and 2 wasn't just its polish or its world building, but the responsiveness of everything that you did. did. Little moments often carried as much weight as the big ones. So when that feedback loop weakens as it does in Act 3, the stakes begin to feel manufactured rather than actually earned and felt. Personally, Act 3 taught me something. It taught me that choice doesn't matter when no one's left to care about it. And in a game built on consequence, that silence feels louder than any failure. Now, this is really the underlying cause of almost every problem in Act 3. If you've watched some of my previous videos, you'll know I've discussed the cut content of this game in great detail, and I even have multiple videos dedicated to the topic. So I think it's no surprise to anyone that the act most affected by the game's sheer abundance of cut content is of course its biggest act, Act 3. When you first arrive at the city of Baldur's Gate, you expect the game to inherently build upon everything the first two acts created, and with that to bring a sense of finality to the entire journey. But much like me, you may have felt a quiet absence, a ghost of where something vast was supposed to be. That absence you feel is in the stories that almost were, the cities that almost stood, and the endings that almost rang true. As you might already know, the most significant cut content in Act 3 specifically is the upper city of Baldur's Gate. When I first wandered into Baldur's Gate for the first time, it surely was mesmerizing, but I do remember thinking that the name Lower City did imply there was an upper city, and I always did find it strange that we never got to explore it. To me, it's clear that the upper city was supposed to be the true capstone of the game as a whole, highlighting the elite of the city and opening new opportunities far beyond what you see in the lower city. But of course, what we got in the final experience was much different. It's no secret that there was a fully explorable upper city initially envisioned for the game, and its absence can be felt in every step in the lower city. Because sure, the city does feel quite expansive, but you'll quickly realize that large spaces of it are inaccessible and don't exist, which is honestly just disappointing. But of course, you might wonder, what does the upper city being cut actually have to do with the problems of Act 3? Well, it's clear to me that cut content isn't simply a case of missing scenery, but it inherently creates structural imbalances within the game's storytelling. This is because if a character's ending or story was initially supposed to be tied to a quest chain that would occur in the upper city, the cutting of the upper city leads to that story either getting rushed or getting no satisfying ending at all. I personally believe that the lack of an upper city, even aside from the removal of a large region with the potential for interesting quests and characters, created gaps in the game's story. In fact, it's the cutting of the upper city region that actually blocks much of Karlach's character development and the true finality to her arc. Karlach's storyline was initially supposed to be concluded in the upper city, so when that was cut, so was the resolution that she would have gotten. Of course, I find this extremely unfortunate, but it's not just Karlach affected by the cut content of the game's third act. The very shape of Act 3 itself, in terms of the urgency of the plot and the finality of it all, requires of course accompanying locations and reactivity. But when a chunk of the location certain quests were supposed to take place in is cut, the scaffolding of the act itself begins to collapse on itself. Really, the problem with Act 3 all links back to the ambition Larian had and how they were unfortunately not able to fully capitalize on it. The upper city being cut led to a bunch of other content, specifically for different companions also being cut, leading to an absence that feels much bigger than just one region. I think what's most striking about the absence of this content in Act 3 is just how obvious it all feels. Where in other acts there was surely cut content, it never feels like they were incomplete or unfinished. But in Act 3, this feeling can be felt almost as soon as you realize that the lower city is the furthest you get to go in the city of Baldur's Gate. And it really is a shame because the city, even as it is absolutely fantastic. It teems with potential everywhere, from its sprawling rooftops to its glistening towers. But when so many sequences and zones of what was supposed to be vanish, the engine of the narrative doesn't just stall, but it rattles. I specifically felt this when I completed Karlach and Will's quest for the first time, or when I realized that we got very little of the character that Cazador was supposed to be. Of course, it's important to remember that this cut content isn't simply informed speculation from looking around what the game has to offer, but it's admitted by the devs themselves. And it's strange because although Act 3 is by far the largest in terms of content of all three acts, the consequence of much of it being cut leads to a feeling much lighter than the first two. And I think this is where my problem with it comes in. This layering of ambition, cut content, and the issues this causes in turn doesn't itself hurt the game. But when you arrive at the final act of the game with the promise of grandeur and then encounter subtle emptiness in certain stories and quests, it only amplifies the feeling of something being missing. I honestly do feel the absence of the upper city in every playthrough that I do, as where a sprawling city may have once existed, there sits shadows of moments that never came to be. The cutting of the game's largest region leads to untriggered companion lines, endings half written, and quests that simply never started. In fact, I believe my issue with Act 3's reactivity activity actually comes from the fact that a lot of its quests and regions were cut, as data miners found that certain dialogue lines never triggered because the triggers themselves were removed. This creates the feeling of an act carrying the silhouette of a much grander plan, one that was simply never able to be executed. This is all to say that I still love the world of Baldur's Gate 3, from its scale to its ambition, to its fearless reach beyond what most other studios would even attempt. But it's obvious that ambition needs space to breathe, and in Act 3 that space begins to quickly close in. To me, Act 3 is where the weight of everything that Larian built started pressing against its own edges, and even though there may be cracks in the journey specifically in Act 3, there is still something amazing underneath it all. The difficulty of Act 3 is something that I've had an issue with ever since I first played through the act. Again, as the game's final act, you kind of expect it to be the epitome of everything from the story, to the quest, and of course to the combat. But what I personally found in the last stretch of this game was a plateau in our character's growth in combat paired with what is supposed to be the game's biggest fights. For me, what creates this issue in the first place is the fact that the game's level cap is level 12. When I first trudged through the lower city for the first time, after just a couple hours, I was already at max level. And what this does to the game's combat is that it makes it feel like you've hit the apex of how powerful you can get, despite the fact that there are bosses you're still supposed to fight. Where before each act would see you slowly leveling up and gradually gaining all the tools of power, this growth is stunted pretty much at the start of Act 3. This creates a weird dichotomy in how Act 3 pushes you towards the biggest enemies you have to face and the fact that your character has already stopped becoming more powerful. In Act 3, you'd of course expect the climax of everything, but I actually found quite the opposite when it came to combat. The flattening of all of your previous progression makes a boss that is supposed to be your greatest challenge yet feel like an absolute breeze. And now I understand that by this point in the game you would have already mastered much of the combat, but I think this is another reason why the game needed to have a higher level cap. When I first fought Orin and Gortash, I was actually taken aback at how easy both of these fights were. In particular, Orin, who was of course built up as one of the biggest fights in the entire game, was a boss fight I was able to complete within just one turn in my very first playthrough. And all of this comes back to the fact you'll be running around with a max level party that has already spent hours mastering builds, abilities, and gear that every fight in Act 3 can feel flat. Even raising the game's difficulty to Tactician doesn't inherently fix this problem, because it's tied to the feeling that you've just stopped growing, despite the fact the story still has a long way to go. That feeling does bleed itself into the experience of Act 3 as a whole. When we stop seeing new levels, new spells, or meaningful growth with our characters in combat, the tension of what comes next begins to quiet, and really all of it is paradoxical. In Act 3, your power should roar louder than ever before, and you should really be leveling up much more than before, but instead you hit the cap of it all, and hitting this cap makes every fight, bar a few in this act, feel like an absolute cakewalk. Now, to be clear, I don't think this is an issue with the game's combat design. Many of the fights in Act 3 still remain phenomenal, and the tactical richness and environmental interplay of the game's combat mechanics still do shine. But when before you felt the constant escalation of your power, when the game stops giving you room to breathe, everything becomes stagnant. To me, if an act needed progression in combat, it was this act, due to the fact that you've now mastered the combat and perfected your build by this point. From my perspective, the small level cap makes it feel like the enemies and the difficulty are all fixed. It makes you feel like you're playing inside the game's ceiling instead of actively rising through it. So this leads to the game's stakes in this act staying on paper, but in reality the difficulty and challenge of the experience itself drops off a cliff when compared to prior acts. Of course, there are difficult fights like with Raphael for example, but these are so few in number in Act 3 that at that point it doesn't even matter. For me, this is what makes Act 3 so strange. The story is building like it's reaching for the heavens, but the game beneath your hands has already exhaled. It stopped actively fighting you, and that quiet surrender, that soft collapse of what was once challenging, is what lingers long after the credits roll. Even with all of its flaws, especially in Act 3, I still think about Baldur's Gate 3 to this day, because underneath the pacing stumbles, the missing quests, and the hollow echoes of choice, there's still a masterpiece breaking through the cracks. Act 3 may falter in the ways we discussed today, but to me, it doesn't at all erase the incredible journey that led to that point. Act 3 still has its incredible moments, and it's personally my second favorite act. And more than anything, I think it's just a testament to the pure and unbridled ambition of Larian in crafting this game. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. If you enjoyed, please consider subbing to the channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and RPG content, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.